Hi everyone, welcome to the start of making my Crinoline cage hoop for my Disney Ariel dress. As you can see here, I know it doesn't sit quite on Betty and I haven't tightened it as well as it should be. I'm making one of these basically, and as you can see from the shape on the side here, you can see that at the back it's raised upwards a little more because of the bum bag that you have here, which adds great support to a hoop, and it's much needed. So because of that, I'm going to make mine a little bit differently to how they've made these, because they've made this hoop obviously level. This was a pre-bought one, I didn't make this particular one. So what I've done is I've got a pattern piece, which is basically a skirt pattern, taking the measurements from this and the measurement of the length and the waist and the circumference around the bottom of it, and come up with my own pattern pieces. I'm going to make mine in 4 pieces. You don't have to do this, but I am. For some reason, that's how it worked out. So yeah, I've got my pattern piece here. I've already cut out 2 for the front. So I will have a seam at the front. I'm doing a slightly different opening to this. I'm going to have a front opening on mine. I didn't include seam lengths on this of 1.5 centimetres each side, so I'll have to add that on. And I'm using a pink tulle net here, which you can just about see. So these are going to be my back sections. So what I'm going to have to do, we've worked out that there's a 7 centimetre difference to the height on the back, so I will be extending this back piece by 7 centimetres, and then it will have to curve round and join the centre seam here at the same height. So that's what I'm going to do now, and I'll just get cutting out those pieces and I'll be back. So at this point I've got 2 of each section cut, 2 for the front, 2 for the back, which I've pinned together, and you can see that the back has got the 7 centimetres extension, which I've done all the way around, which obviously will not be totally correct because this has got to meet the side seam here. So we'll just sort that out now and then progress. Second thing. Oh. What we've done now is these are our 2 sections for the front of the cage, and because Tracy made the back sections a little bit longer, what we need is to curve this in. This is the back centre seam, and that has got to be 7 centimetres longer, but by the time it comes around to here, it's got to be the same length as the front seam. So what we're going to do first of all is to find our halfway point between these two. It doesn't have to be too accurate. I just put my finger there, and what I've done is I've taken that 7 centimetre measurement and I've halved it to 3.5 and just put a mark there. Now what I'm going to do is find my halfway point between there and the side seam, and I need to halve this measurement again. So roughly about there is halfway. So I'm going to measure that, and it's going to be 3.5 plus almost 2. So I'm going to put another mark there, and then coming around to this side, find roughly about the halfway point. This is the back centre seam, so by the time it gets to the halfway point between there and there, it needs to be curving around. So about halfway between the 2 marks is roughly about 2 centimetres. You don't have to be too accurate. So what happens now is that you've got a good idea where your curve is going to be. So using my eye only, I can now put a mark on
where
Because you've got a hardboard under, you don't have to mark your tablecloth.
Oh yeah. Where it's going to be cut. So there, just move this all around a bit, and it's got to finish at the lowest point. You can see where your next one is going to be. There we go. So this is going to be our curve for the back sections, and you need to cut it from the centre back to the side seam.
So taking our back section, we've pinned the seam allowance from the top where the waist is, 1.5 centimetres in for your seam allowance, pinned it all the way together to the bottom. I've put a reference here so I remember that this is the back seam, just going through one of the pieces, which was the 7 centimetres longer than it is at the front. And obviously it's now been cut, and that will be the side seam. Okay, I appreciate the lighting isn't very good, but right here I've got my hoop pink net lined out, and I've joined all the seams. You just about see them, 1, 2, 3, and the front sections are still open. Next we need to work out how long to do because it's going to be a front opening, how long to do the opening. And I've taken the measurement from this, because this is pretty good, it's got a back opening of 20 centimetres from the top to the bottom, including some seam allowance. Okay, so I'm doing the front section here, and as I said earlier, I need to leave a 20 centimetre gap from the top to the bottom. As I said, from the top to 20 is where we need to make our mark. Okay, so now I've got my 20 centimetre gap at the top, and I've started sewing here, and the top section is now open.
After sewing up the final seam, we're now left with the seam edge. So what we're going to do now is turn over 1.5 centimetres of this. Just pin that down. All the way up to the top back. Okay, and this seam will be pressed open. What we're going to do is sew a straight line along the edge and then sew across. Then we're going to sew a zigzag line going up this way, and then that will keep that seam in place.
Okay, so you can see now that I've done my stitching and the zigzag set things on the left here. So that's nice and strong. You can put extra facing on it if you want to. I've actually gone over it a few times when I went across the bottom here to strengthen that part as well. So that's all nice and neatened off, and that's that part complete for now. What I'm doing now is I've got my I'll call it petticoat now, on here, the net base for my cage, and I've got the seam here, and I'm just taking the iron and I'm flattening out the seam, because I'll be wanting to put boning channels on after, and you want to really make sure that the seam is pressed flat. I might run a sewing line down each side so it helps the edges of that seam allowance just stay flat, but we'll see. So that's the next thing to do, and do that on all seams. Okay, because the net tool is really hard to see marks on, what I've done is just cut off some little strips of spare bias that is not the colour I'm going to be using, and I've marked from the top 20 centimetres all the way around, but basically I started on the back here as my first guide, and then put one on the seam and then filled in between. So the very edge of this is 21 centimetres right up to the top edge of the skirt. 20 centimetres, sorry, not 21, 20. So that will be the first placement of my bias binding. So these little markers are quite handy as a guide to going all the way around. I forgot to say earlier, I'm using this bias binding. It's salmon pink colour to match the pink of the petticoat. You don't have to because it won't be seen, but I thought I'd match it. As I said, this was 15mm wide bias. I'm using bias because it goes round the curve a lot more easily than a ribbon will, and you get a bit more bend on a bias grain than, as I say, a straight cut. So I bought this off eBay. You can get this in hundreds of places. Just search bias binding, and this is a matte bias binding. You can get a satin one. The satin one's often very slippery to deal with, and that would have been hell. So I'm not going to use satin bias on this. It had to be nice coarse matte binding. This pink bias that I bought, that's 15mm wide, and I need to turn in an end by about 1.5 centimetres I've done. Next I want to take this centre seam, and I need a gap each side of 5 centimetres. So keeping this edge in line with the bottom edge of the opening there, and measuring 5 centimetres in, you can now pin the start of your bias in place. So this crease line, this is where the 21 centimetres will be. You're going to open it out and you're going to be sewing into that crease line on the bias. Okay, so I'm just starting to pin my bias on here, and you can see now where these handy little markers came in handy for the 20 centimetres from the top edge to the bottom there. And I've got to open out this crease, but I still want to be able to see the crease that's on the bias there. That crease line should line up with the very top edge of where these marks are. So then obviously that will be open. So I'm just going to go from there to there and line that up. Put a bit of a weight there, that's quite handy. Hold it down. Just put a pin there, and it helps if you put your pins upwards. So now you can go to the middle, open that one up and pin that. So that crease line should line up with the top edge of each of your markers all the way around. Okay, so we've come back to the beginning now, and just temporarily I've pinned the bias right way back to the centre front seam here. Obviously we still need the gap, so remember I left the 5 centimetres from that centre. So I'm just going to measure from the centre inwards, and that's 5 centimetres there. Sorry, I had to move that a second, my camera woman's gone away. So that'll be 5 centimetres there, and then we need the 1.5 centimetre turnover, which I might leave for now. I'll probably do it at the end of the sewing this on. So we're good to go. When you're sewing around, you'll be sewing into this crease line, and you don't want to sew on the blue bits. So before you get to them on machine, remember to take out these little blue markers. Okay, so I've now sewed on my bias binding all the way around, and just to doubly make sure that it's okay, I did do this earlier while it was pinned, but it's a good idea to fold this in half. So you've got the back seam there and your front seam here, and the side seams here, matching up and all level at the top here. And you can see that's worked out pretty well, and the bias, I haven't got one strip slightly lower or one higher, so that's good. Okay, so just showing you what I'm doing with the bias. as I said earlier, I'm sewing along the crease line on the bottom here. Just go forwards and backwards to start it off. You need to go very, very slow with this. Just do it a little bit at a time. Don't try and stretch it or stretch it like that as you go. Just hold it down enough to be flat, because otherwise you could stretch it out of place. So just let the machine do most of the work and run it along with the. Okay, and I'll be doing that all the way along until I get back to the beginning. Just remember when you come to where your blue markers out, to take them out, like so, and put in the bin. Otherwise you end up sewing blue markers on, which I have done in a couple of places. Silly me, but never mind. I shall carry on. Okay, I've now come round to near the very beginning, and as you know, I've been marking 5 centimetres from the centre seam as a distance to stop, and I marked that with a pin, but I want to take this out in a second, and I've just marked with a pen there a line. And what I'm going to do before I even get to the end, I'm going to stop there and go backwards and finish that off and just take it out the machine. Okay, so going back to the beginning, the other side where I started, I'm now going to flip that over, making sure that the crease is folded out, not folded in. Make sure it's folded out flat. Put that into the machine, and I'm going to be sewing halfway between that crease and the edge. There is what I worked out is enough to get my boning in, but it depends how wide your boning is. But you don't want it too loose, because then the bone, I find, they tend to get twisted. So you want it just snug, that it stays still. So again, without stretching it too much, just enough to hold it flat, to a little, not taut, but a little bit with your fingers each side, to make sure that's folded out as well at the top. Again, as I say, don't go like that, just enough to make sure. Just aim halfway between the crease and the very edge of the bias, and then just continue like that all around to the other side. Okay, so you can see I've stopped about there. That's my pen line, that's my finish line, and I want to turn, as I did at the very beginning, a bit inwards, but leave the top flat, open the bottom out, and turn it in where that mark is. So if I can just see, I can just see my mark there, so that's my crease line, and I just want to turn the edge in on that. So I'm just going to run a sewing line down the end there. I'm being a little bit lazy here. And I go right to the end and then I go back again, just to make sure. There we go, so that just then seals the end. So you've got your turn in. I'll tidy those bits up after. So just gonna cut that off right there. Now I can put it back under the machine, and where I finished earlier, back in. And just carry on right to the end here. Okay, so then that brings us to the end. Like so. Okay, so due to the end of my bias binding, I've stopped, finished off there, because I need to turn the end of this in, so open it all out and just so okay, so there we go, that's sewn down, so I just need to carry on and finish sewing that round to the end as the same with the others. Okay, so as I said before, my hoop, I've got a front seam is slightly shorter than the back seam. The back seam was extended by 7 centimetres. So what I've done first is I've placed my last boning channel marker, these are just markers at the moment, on the very bottom of the skirt. That's the first thing to do. I have 5 rings that I'm left to do, so I need to divide 5 into that measurement of 69.5 and I get 13.9. So you then have to measure on the top bias strip that you just sewed on, but you'll take a measure halfway up it, so the halfway point between the 2 edges. You can see I'm placing my tape measure from there all the way down to the centre of the bias strip on the bottom where my thumbnail is. So you're measuring from the centre of each bias strip from the very top to the bottom, and I get 69.5 centimetres. So I've got my back seam here, and I've done exactly the same again as earlier. I've placed a tab at the bottom here, and I measured between the centre of that tab all the way up to the centre of the bias here at the top, exactly the same as I've done the front, except as mentioned earlier the back seam is slightly longer, so when I measured it I got 69.5, sorry, I got 75 centimetres, that's the wrong one, 75 centimetres, and I divide that by 5 rings again, so my spacings were 15 centimetres between the centre of each tab. Remember, from the centre, not from the edge. So that more or less works out. And again, there's a couple of millimetre difference on the bottom one, but it should be okay. So now I'm going to work round to the side seam. The side seam here, which will be a different measurement again slightly. Measuring from the centre of the bias to the centre of the bias tag strip I've got at the bottom here, and I get 68 centimetres. I'll then divide that by the 5 rings again, I get 13.6 centimetres. So from the top here I need 13.9 centimetres. I've marked it with a red marker on the ruler here, 13.9 centimetres from the centre, and the centre of your bias strip should be halfway between the 0 on the tape measure. So you're not measuring the edge, you're measuring the centre. So then you go on to the next one and be exactly the same, measure from the centre of your back strip to the centre of the next strip, and that should work out from that centre point there to that 13.9. And then same again, each centre is 13.9 from there to there, and the same again from 0 to 13.9, and the bottom one may be up by just a millimetre or two, but it's nothing to worry about because it was a bit of an odd measurement to start with. So here we go. That roughly gives you then all your markers for the front seam. I've just laid my skirt out on the floor here, and I've got the side seams levelled up, so I've just put the sellotape. It's a quite a heavy weight thing just to hold it there. Make sure the top edges are level, make sure the bottom edges are level on the sides, to make sure all my marks are the same both side seams, and they look pretty good. You can just see through to the back there on the other side of my marks, that they're lasting up, because what you don't want is one that is slightly higher one side and one the other, because then one ring on one side seam might be like that and the other might be like that. So you want to make sure this is perfectly level, and it seems to be good so far. Okay, what I've going to do now with some help is I've done the halfway points as earlier on the side seams and the front and back seams. I've now gone and filled in tabs using exactly the same method all the way around, and I've checked it to make sure that they line up. So now I'll be doing the same again. I'll be sewing my pink bias on row by row, so I'll see you when I get to the bottom. So I'm going along, obviously I want to make sure this net is totally flat, so I'm putting on these weights to try and keep each section as I go along and pin it on as tight as I possibly can without stretching it too much. So it's easier said than done because I'm getting further and further down and the spacing's wider and wider. Okay, I'm now on the very bottom layer, and I'm going to tackle this a little bit differently. Instead of going from the bottom and then flipping up, from the top and then flipping it down and sewing along here, I'm lining up this bottom edge of the bias, so I've got it out like so, and I'm trying to line up this crease line with the bottom edge just barely, just so there's enough peeking through, and then I'll be flipping it up that way instead. This is just so, because it's a bit hard to explain, but if I did it that other way, as I've been doing, just pretend this is bias for a second, by the time I flip it down, although I think this edge is perfectly straight, it is a little bit higgledy-piggledy in places. Some pieces just a millimetre too shorter. So I really want to make sure that this lines up on the edge, so I've decided to do it this way instead. So just doing the opposite way to help in doing it. I hope that makes sense. So I'm just going to carry on, and I'm not going to pin it all the way around because that would just be insane. I'd much prefer to probably line the edge upon the machine, will be a lot easier. I've now completed all 6 channels on my skirt. The next thing to do will be you can either work on your waistband or you can work on the measurements for your boning. I think at this stage I'm going to do the measurements for the boning just to make sure that it's all working out before I go to all the trouble of putting the waistband on.